Oh man, what a gorgeous place I'm in. I could stay here all year, but we've got to get back up at some point. So let me just continue these really good comments. And here is probably one of the best ones. Peter Scheer. Peter, I'd love to meet you sometime. We need to knock heads, go out and have some coffee together, because you get it perfectly. In fact, this is not really a question. This is more of a statement. I'm going to read what you say, and then I'm going to unpack it, because you put so much good material into your statements. You really do and understand it, and you're actually applying it. And I love that. I love anybody that does that, because not only do you get it, but you know how then to use it in a real-time framework. Now, here's what you say. And you're talking about Mecca. Why in the world did they choose Mecca? This is the question you're bringing up. Why in the world, after Petra, which was such a great place and had been there for so many centuries, why in the world did they finally choose Mecca? Well, before we even get into that, remember, Petra had to be thrown out, because Petra was destroyed in 713 by a huge earthquake, which destroyed most of the edifice. So at that point, by the 8th century, they had to leave Petra, and that's why Petra has been deserted ever since. But before 713, before the 8th century, Petra was the seat of the Nabatean kingdom, was the seat of what later became Islam, what was the seat, certainly, of the sanctuary for the Umayyads, from Muawiyah all the way up until they started losing their control. And it was the Abbasids who then chose Mecca. So why did the Abbasids choose Mecca? Let's go ahead and see what you say here. I am convinced 100% regarding your thesis about Petra, and I definitely agree with your analysis of the early Qibla directions, including your explanation of the methodology used to compute the direction. What is still a mystery to me is, why was the new Mecca located where it was? It does not look like it would provide a strong military defense. It's not on any trade routes, as you point out, and it doesn't have a lot of water. It is in a desert, for heaven's sakes. So if someone is going to move Mecca, or the sanctuary, from Petra to its current location in Mecca, why would that particular sittas or sittam be chosen? Why would that particular area or that city be chosen? That the later Mecca. Great question. Well, I'm going to answer you for 5 reasons that I've come up with, some of which you've already said, and I'm just going to echo you on this. Number 1, you are correct. Well, first of all, I agree with you. Well, otherwise, why? Of course I agree with you, because I like everything you say, Peter. We think alike, and I can see you're a historian, you like to look at history, and you like to unpack what you see from history. But take a look. Why in the world would they have chosen Mecca? Historically, it's in a place no one's ever heard of. No one ever heard it. And this is one of the reasons why, when we've been going through all the references, the accusations that Mecca has been found, look at the historical. I'm just going to put up this map here. Well, here, let me put up this map. I mean, when you look at it historically, I mean, I'll put it up on the screen so you can see it better than me just holding it up here. When you look at it, you can see this whole central part of Arabia. There's just no history there. There's a reason why there's no history there, because there are no cities there. The reason why there's no cities there, because there's no kingdoms there of any note. It was a backwater. It was, historically speaking, it had no significance historically. There were no big rivers. Most cities were built on rivers, because rivers is how you do the trade. You use rivers to take goods back and forth. So that's why the Euphrates and the Tigris River, which are over here, look at that whole area that's green. Do you notice that whole area over here that's green? See, that's where civilization existed. But Mecca's way down here. Look at, hundreds of miles away, or I don't even, maybe even 1,000. But what you're looking at here, that is all green because of the rivers that are there. And rivers are what are the lifeblood of any civilization and the lifeblood of any city. So because of that, you can see why historically there's just no reference to anything, because there's nothing there. It's all brown. It's all brown. So that gets into the second area, and that's the topography. topographically speaking, it really has no significance whatever. And we have said this over and over again. Dr. Patricia Corona, back in her book in 1987, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, made this point so clearly. There is just no trade that went through this place called Mecca at all. It's not on any trade route. And she looked at from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and couldn't find any reference at all for this city on any trade route. Now, what's interesting, there is a trade that goes from Najran, and I'm going to put it up on the map. You can see it goes up from Aden in the south. Let's look at Aden in the south, goes up to Sana, up to Najran, and then went through Taif. And there you can see Taif. Taif is just southeast of what is today Mecca. And from Taif, it went directly up to Yathrib, which is now Medina. And from Yathrib, it went up to Khaybar, then Tabuk, and then on up to Gaza in the north. Those are references that have been around for years and centuries. And that's why she said she can follow the trade route. That trade route did exist. What was interesting, it was not a significant trade route, and it was not a trade route that was very popular, and it was a trade route that only included basically milk and leather. You don't build an empire on milk and leather. So topographically speaking, you can see the reason why that trade route even existed, because it follows that Western Plateau. And you can see that Western Plateau when you look at this map here. When you look at this map here, you can see it along there. Right up there. There's the Western Plateau. It followed that Western Plateau. Mecca is not on that Western Plateau. It's off the Western Plateau. And that's why topographically speaking, Patricia Corona said, why hadn't anybody noticed this before? Why hadn't anybody looked at the topography? Take a look and see where Mecca is. It is in one of the most desolate places. Topographically speaking, it would make no sense because it had no water down there. There's no rivers to accommodate any large caravans or even to give it vegetation. And that's why topographically speaking, it just made no sense. What about politically speaking? Well, since there was no empire down there, we don't know of any big empire. We don't know of any large cities or people that would have had any sway, politically speaking. That just does not appear in any political annals. Take a look at all the historical material. Everything that we see historically that happens way up here, up in this area. This is Petrea, the Romans in the 1st and 2nd century. All this area is where all the politics take place, because that's where people were living. That's where the empires were. The empires were all around the Mediterranean. There was nothing, as we said, as we noticed, there was nothing down here. There was no empire, no reference, politically speaking, to a people who are from the line of from Abraham lived down there. And certainly Abraham didn't live down there. The Jews didn't live down there. Ask anybody, ask any Jew, ask any Christian if this is where Abraham and all the prophets lived. Not one Christian would agree with you. There's no reference anywhere to the prophets living down here. They all lived up here. Way up here, 600 to 1,000 miles further north. Nothing ever happened politically down here. So where politically are the Muslims getting this notion that Mecca was always at the center of the world, the center of the trade, the center of all the political landscape? It did not exist. There was no political emphasis down there. No political oligarchy or anything that would give it any. And certainly that's why it's not in any historical annals. No one hears about it. No one writes about it. Dionysius never writes about it. Ptolemy never writes about it. None of the Romans who traveled all over that part of the world wrote about a political entity of note anywhere in the Hijaz outside of what is in the north and what is in the south. In the Hadramat area, in what is today Yemen and Oman, yes. Up in the north, in Eritrea, yes. But not in the central area. In fact, Ptolemy didn't even know about it. He didn't even go up there. And many of the references to places like Makaraba, as we've already discussed, Makaraba is nowhere near it because he had never traveled in that area. He didn't realize that there was nothing up there. And so he put Makaraba, which is just in the, and I'll show you where Makaraba is. Look at where Makaraba is. It's just in the northern part, is near Najran. It's very close to the Yemeni border. It's way down south. It's nowhere near Mecca. So you can see why, politically speaking, it just makes sense. Economically, well, we've already covered that. Economically, there was nothing there economically. That's why no trade went there. And remember, Patricia Corona made this big point. In her book, she went through 15 spices, 15 different spices, took a chapter per spice and showed that these were the 15 spices that the Islamic traditions said existed and made Mecca rich. And she said not one of those spices came from Mecca, not one of the 15. They all came from what is today the African coast. They came from Africa. And you can see the 5 cities that we have here in Africa, but I'll just put them up there. You can see, take a look at those 5 cities. Those are the trade routes. That is the trade route up the Red Sea. Take a look at them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is where the trade route went. It went right up the Red Sea. Not any of the trade route went up through along the Arab coast. Why? Because there was no water there. They had no water. There were no rivers. There was no reason to stop off in that area. Since there's no water, then of course there would be no way to replenish your water on the Arabian coast. We brought this up a few months ago. And that's why this whole notion that there was a sea route completely has been thrown out of the water, because we found out that Jeddah, which is the port for Mecca. Look at Jeddah here. There's it is, the port for Mecca. Jeddah didn't even exist till the 8th century. It only existed once Mecca was chosen. Once Mecca was created, then Jeddah had to be created so that it could be a port to bring all the provisions up to Mecca. Because Mecca had no vegetation, Mecca had no water. It needed a port like Jeddah, and that's why Jeddah is so late. It is not early. Yanbu, which is further north, is well known because Yanbu was the place that actually accommodated, was the port for Yathrib. But not Jeddah, not Jeddah. So you can see, economically speaking, it was not anywhere near the trade route. It was not on any trade route. Patricia Crone destroyed any notion of the land route going through Mecca. It went from Taif straight up to Yathrib, and we destroyed it just a few weeks ago. Any notion that the trade route went up by the Red Sea, up through the water route, because the 3 channels, the central channel and the other 2 channels which the boats needed, because it was deep enough for them to go along, are all on the African coast. They're over on the west side of the Red Sea, not on the eastern side. So economically speaking, Peter, you're correct. There is no reason why Mecca should have been chosen. Let's go then to the 5th and final reason, and that is spiritually. Take and ask yourself this question. I want Muslims to respond to this. Where is there any religious tradition prior to the 8th century that includes Mecca? Where is there any religious tradition prior to the 8th century that has any reference to Mecca? Now, I could have said 7th century. Notice I'm not even saying 7th century. I'm saying the 8th century. Because you can't even find anything in the 7th century. Any religious tradition, any religious writings, any religious text that includes Mecca. Not one. Not one. Theologically speaking, it was in the backwater, if it even existed. I don't even think it existed, because we can't find it on any maps. Patricia Crone knew this back in 1987. We can't find it on any trade routes. We can't even find it referenced anywhere in any historical annals. And religiously speaking, it had nothing to do, any religions, all the religions, whether they're in the north or in the south, they had nothing to do with Mecca. Nothing to do with Mecca. What's more, once Mecca was chosen as the seat of the sanctuary, as the place where finally they were to pray and all the mosques were then to turn to, remember, Mecca is not located for any of the Qiblas. None of the mosques are facing Mecca until 727. Let me repeat that. Until 727, there is no mosque facing Mecca. They are all facing Petra up until 706. All of them. That's the beginning of the 8th century. Then in 706, you get the in-between mosque, the Wasat Mosque, created and built by Al-Hajjaj, the governor, way up in Kufa. And then all his mosques up in Iraq are facing that in-between point. But it's not till 727, as the Umayyads are now decreasing, the Abbasids are starting to come into power. They're not in power yet, but they're starting to get stronger and become into authority. That's when Mecca is finally introduced as the sanctuary, proving that Mecca did not exist prior to the 8th century. Prior to the 8th century. So I'm going to ask you Muslims, show me any tradition, show me any reference point, show me where Abraham lived in Mecca prior to the Qur'an saying so in Surah chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. It doesn't really say Mecca, it just says where the Kaaba is, where the sanctuary is. That's where he went to. Now we know that the Kaaba and the sanctuary was way up in Petra. So it more than likely chapter 21 is referring to Petra, though it doesn't give a name. In chapter 27 of the Quran, from verse 17 to 44, you have Solomon supposedly living in Mecca, supposedly fighting his battles with birds, dropping stones on top of those who they're going to kill, all in Mecca, though it doesn't say Mecca. Notice it doesn't say Mecca. It just infers it. Muslims assume that that's Mecca. You won't find the word Mecca in the Quran except one place. Chapter 48, verse 24. That's it. Chapter 48, verse 24. If this is such an important city, if this is such a historical city, if this is the seat of the empire, if this is where Adam and Eve actually were thrown down to, if this is where Abraham lived, if this is where Solomon lived, if all these great kings lived there, then why in the world is there no reference to it in the Quran? Except one place. One place. And even that is probably, that as we now know, when the Quran was being put together in the 8th century, they included it finally because it had to be, they had to name it in that. So spiritually speaking, it is not the seat of any religious movement at all. Historically, no one's ever heard of it. Topographically, it makes no sense strategically because there's nothing there. Politically, there's no political reference point. There's no great empire for it to be a political dominance. Economically, it's not on any trade route, either land or by the sea. There's just nothing there to have given it its economic clout. And spiritually, it's not referred to in any religious annals, any religious text at all, until finally the Quran and the traditions finally give it its importance. But that's 8th, 9th, and 10th century. So, great question. Why then was Mecca chosen? I know you want me to answer that, Peter, but I don't. I'm reticent to answer why it was finally chosen. I've already given the answer. You know what it is. And I said in my previous views, and I said in my previous videos, that I think it was chosen because that is where Zubair took the black stone. The black stone that existed in Petra when he destroyed Petra back in the 680s, and he fled away from Abd al-Malik, fled down to the south to his home place. It looks like he must have fled to Mecca. And when you take the black stone with you, remember, the viewpoint from that point, in fact, has always been that wherever the black stone is, there is God's presence. And the reason for that probably is because it was probably a meteorite that came from the skies and it came down to earth. The people saw it and they thought, this is God's presence. And so they started worshiping it and they started going to it. And that's why when he brought the black stone down to Mecca, then of course, once it's in Mecca, all the pilgrims start coming to Mecca from all over. And they start, once and not only were they coming to Mecca from all over, then they start pointing their mosques towards Mecca from all over, from 727. So that's why I think Mecca was chosen. It was chosen by accident. And it was a poor choice. They should never have chosen Mecca. It did not have any water. It did not have any vegetation. It's in the desert. It's surrounded by wadis that do not have water in them, and then mountains at a distance. There is nothing there historically. There is no political entity there. There is nothing there religiously. There is nothing there to give it a history. And that's why it was devoid of any history, devoid of any importance, devoid of any empire, devoid of even any people. And that's why it took so long for them to finally create that narrative. That narrative was introduced by Ibn Hisham in 833, and then supported and substantiated by Al-Bukhari in 870. Remember, even in the Quran it didn't get it right. The Quran only has 3 prayers, and it doesn't say prayers towards Mecca. There's only 3 prayers, morning, afternoon, and evening. It's Al-Bukhari that gives us the other 2 in the evening. And that all comes in introduced in the late 9th century. So everything we know about Mecca, everything we know about its importance, everything we know about its history and its theological significance, all comes from the traditions, 9th and 10th century traditions. As we've been saying, this is nothing more than a invention based on a legend, based on a myth. And we're destroying that myth now. And the only thing we're doing is to use historical evidence. What a way to destroy the myth, to destroy the legend. We're mythbusters is what we are. Peter, you get it. I get it. Mel from Sneakers Corner gets it. I hope the rest of you get it. Can you see we're creating a whole new narrative, one based on historical evidence, not on traditions. Where are you going to stand? Over here or over here? Come on home, come on home. Because this is the problem. This is, I think, the elephant that's in the room for Islam. What are they going to do with their history? And what are they going to do with Mecca? Why in the world did they choose Mecca? It's the worst choice in the world. It has nothing to give it, nothing to go for it, nothing to support it. Historically, religiously, politically, topographically, in every category, it fails. God bless you. This is Jay. What a beautiful day. Can you hear the birds over here? They've just landed. The egrets are over here in this pond. I just love this type of environment. Wish I could stay here all year, but I can't. Okay then, this is Jay. Over and out.